Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our April Focus event. Today we are talking about practical challenges of the modern workplace. My name is Ashley Wong. If I haven't met you, it's nice to meet you and great to have you here. I'm an attorney on the team here at Equinox, and today we're going to be talking about various features of the workplace and benefits that employees may be asking for or that you may be offering or considering in order to remain competitive and attracting and retaining talent. So here in the greater Seattle area, we have one of the most competitive markets really in the nation. I had seen a Seattle Times article that said that we had grown to 4th in the nation as far as competitiveness and economic growth in the country. So what that results in is under normal times, as of 3 or 4 months ago, low unemployment, which means that all of the skilled workers are being scooped off the market pretty quickly, which means that competitors really have to do a little bit extra to remain competitive to gain those skilled workers. So obviously when we scheduled this focus event several months ago, the world was a very different place. I think there are certain topics that we'll cover today that may actually even be more pertinent in today's very unique workplace challenges, particularly the issue of managing a remote workforce. So we're going to spend actually the bulk of our time today talking about remote working and drafting an effective remote work policy. We are going to tackle a few other interesting benefits that folks are offering in today's modern workforce as well, but we are going to spend the bulk of our time today on remote work. Before we get into the presentation, a few housekeeping items. So first, this presentation is for informational and educational purposes only. This is not legal advice. We always recommend talking with an attorney about your specific circumstances before taking or refraining from any action. And we are recording this presentation. It will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you do have questions, you can send them through the chat function or through the Q&A. We may have time to get to questions today, but if we don't have time to address your question, or if your question looks like it's more specific to your circumstances, then we can follow up with you afterwards. If there are a number of questions that we're not able to get to, then we may send out an FAQ afterwards if it's relevant to, if it's something that a lot of the attendees would maybe want to know. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and get into the agenda. So first, we're going to be discussing remote work. Like I said, we're going to spend the bulk of our time there today, since it just is a highly relevant issue for almost all employers now. And we're then going to talk a little bit about flexible schedules and unlimited PTO, alcohol in the workplace, pet-friendly offices, and technology and social media in the workplace. So first, I want to go over a few themes and principles that you might see come up throughout the presentation, and that just generally you want to keep in mind when you're crafting any kind of policies or thinking about what it means to attract and retain talent. So first, technology. Now this can be both a blessing and a curse, as we're seeing now. That technology has given us a great power to be able to connect our teams from long distances, and especially when we can't be in the office. It can also be a challenge to overcome, including issues like confidentiality and security and impacts to productivity. But of course, it can also make us more productive. So it can be used well when done in the right way, properly. We also see a lot of impacts in the workplace around globalization. We see a lot of increased cultural diversity in the workforce, different generations, different backgrounds, which can again really enhance and be a benefit to a company, but can also present its own challenges as well. Clarity of expectations. So I do want to touch on this. We're going to talk about a lot of areas where we could be crafting policies, and the point of crafting a policy is not to micromanage or to sort of be overly expeditious, but to make sure that we have clarity of what the expectations are of our employees, so that we have sort of the peace and harmony, and that everyone's sort of treating everybody with respect, and just creating some level of ability to explain to employees, when there's a problem, or, if it gives you also a lever as an employer to be able to say, that's not in line with our policies or our values. Consistency in application, and this is both also kind of jumping off of the clarity of expectations, that when you are consistent in the way that you apply your policies, that employees know exactly what to expect, and also to avoid claims of discrimination. Treating employees differently can result in a feeling that everyone's not being treated equally, and if an employee is a member of a protected class, then that can result in claims of discrimination, which can be a real problem. Balancing morale and management. Again, the goal here is not to micromanage employees, but to find those benefits that we can offer that can really help to boost morale, but also managing those in a way that helps them to really work. And then constantly changing landscape. So as anything with the law, some of the areas that we are going to be talking about today, specifically, data privacy, cybersecurity, employment, these are areas that are constantly changing. So we want to make sure that we're really staying up to date on what that looks like. And even with diversity in the workforce, Washington has made a couple of changes just in the last 12 months to add protected classes, specifically obesity and the Crown Act, which protects different types of hair and hairstyles in the workplace, so that you cannot take any adverse action against employees based on those factors as well. So those are sort of interesting changes and updates that are always happening. So make sure that we're keeping on top of those things so that we're not sort of stepping into really challenging areas. Okay, so first, getting into remote work. So this is obviously something that we've all been thrust into, whether we wanted to or not. And while the ideal scenario would be that we had time to really thoughtfully think through what a remote work policy would look like and what it would look like to manage a remote workforce, that's not the reality that a lot of us are dealing with now. So we're going to go through the various issues that we might need to consider in managing a remote workforce and crafting a really effective remote work policy. The first thing we're going to talk about here is a scope of remote work. Now, I'm going to address this as what it would look like in normal times, not in COVID-19 world that we're living in right now. But then, of course, I will touch on how COVID-19 does impact our remote work policies and what kind of expectations that we can have as employers. So first, scope is a remote work policy really appropriate for your company? Of course, if you're a grocery store, it's probably not going to work for you to have a remote workforce substantially. There may be some corporate employees who can work remotely, but for the most part, your employees are going to have to be in-house. That's the same thing for manufacturing. If you have to have people on the factory floor, it may not be appropriate for your company. So looking at the scope, we're going to look at the who, what, when, and where, and why. So why would you even adopt a remote work policy? Is it something that your employees are really asking for? Is it a benefit that you really want to be able to offer? Do you have limited office space that it would really be a benefit to you to be able to free up some office space and have folks working remotely or working from home? So the who. So as we're looking at the scope of a remote work policy, the first question we're going to ask is, who is appropriate to work from home? So we might have some employees, again, that are completely appropriate. So sales personnel, marketing personnel, they could realistically do their jobs from anywhere. I think that we've seen in the last few weeks that even if we didn't believe that some of our employees would be able to work from home successfully, that we have hopefully risen to the challenge to make that happen. Myself, I'm able to work from home completely remotely, really fairly seamlessly. So the who. So there may be, some certain employees that are more appropriate than others to be working from home. And this can also be handled on a case-by-case basis. So obviously with remote work, there has to be a level of accountability and a level of trust with the employee. So so as employees start working from home, you may find that accountability needs to be greater. You may find that the trust is there or isn't there. So, there may be some flexibility that you want to build into your policy to allow for an approval process to gain a work from home ability as an employee. What can employees do when they're working from home? Especially if you're dealing with particularly sensitive information, if you're in the healthcare space and you're handling patient information, protected health information, or if you have highly confidential information, or if you have even contractual obligations that would prohibit employees from working remotely at least without the use of certain technological protections, then there may be certain restrictions as to what an employee can do when working from home. For instance, can an employee take a credit card payment when they're working from home if that's part of their job? So there may be some restrictions around what employees can do when working from home. So processing payments, especially, maybe being one of them in order to remain PCI compliant. When can an employee work from home? So we want to make sure that we clarify to our employees, when is it appropriate for them to be working from home? So are they, and I say work from home, but working from home may actually mean working from somewhere else. So are they allowed to work from home or work remotely at their discretion anytime they want? Or are there restrictions around when it would be appropriate to be working remotely? So maybe it's a benefit where they can only work once a week on Fridays, or maybe it's twice a month on any day that they choose. So if there any restrictions around when an employee would be able to work from home or work remotely should be made clear to the employee. Do they need to get approval from their managers? Those sorts of things, making sure that those are clear in the policies and making sure that those expectations are set with the employee. And then, of course, the where. So employees may be working remotely from home, as many are right now, or they might be working from somewhere else. Maybe they're working from a shared workspace. Maybe they're working from a Starbucks. Maybe they're working from somewhere else in another country. We actually do have one of our employees working from Taiwan right now. So that's, the power of technology that we're able to work from halfway across the world. But there might be some restrictions around what they can do when they're working from other locations, or it may not be appropriate for them to work from anywhere that's not a controlled environment. So if they're dealing with particularly sensitive information, working in a shared workspace or at a Starbucks or something like that might not be appropriate, and it might actually be a violation of certain contractual obligations or data privacy laws. So you might want to keep that in mind as to what the scope of that employee's job is and where they're working from. So for instance, our employee that we have in Taiwan, she's not going to be handling any specific client information. It's going to be more just general, general work that doesn't involve sort of sharing confidential client information across those borders. So just making sure that we set any appropriate restrictions there to maintain the privacy and security of our proprietary and confidential information. So once we've defined the scope and we know who can work from home and under what circumstances they can work from home or work remotely, we're going to look at work hours and time tracking. Now we want to make sure that we're really careful that we're paying our employees appropriately and correctly when they are working remotely. So the first question is going to be to know your employee's classification. So there's this concept of an employee really falling into two buckets, and that is going to be exempt or non-exempt. And what that's referring to is being exempt from minimum wage and overtime laws, or not exempt from those laws. So generally speaking, and this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but for the purposes of this presentation, generally speaking, employees will fall into one of these two buckets, and that would be determined by doing two tests, one being the salary test and the other being the duties test. So for an employee to be exempt, they have to meet certain salary expectations, meaning that they have to be paid on a salary basis. And so that speaks to the structure of the employee's pay, as well as meeting certain minimum thresholds of those salary amounts. And then the duties test. So now there are certain positions and different types of roles that can be exempt, and each of those has a different test that you have to meet. So they have to meet both the salaries test and the duties test in order to be considered exempt from minimum wage and overtime laws. Now, if an employee is not exempt, then you do have to pay them minimum wage and overtime, which means that they need to be tracking their work hours and that you do need to be paying them any for overtime rates for any overtime that they do work, which is hours over 40 hours in any given work week. I've noted commissioned employees here. We actually get this question kind of semi-frequently. I've been getting it quite a bit just over the last few months. Is when is a commissioned employee going to be considered exempt or non-exempt? So commissioned employees have their own test, and it's a three-part test. I won't kind of lay it all out in detail here, but just know that if you do have commissioned employees, it can be a bit of a complicated algorithm to figure out whether they are exempt or non-exempt, and it may be different for across your various commissioned employees, just depending on what your base salary and your structure of their pay looks like there. So I just wanted to make a note of that. So again, with your non-exempt employees, when you do craft your remote work policy, you want to, or even your employee handbook, you want to make sure that it's clear that they do need to be tracking their work hours, and making it clear what your specific process is for tracking work hours. So do you have a specific system that they have to be tracking their work hours inside, and making sure that they're clear about what is considered work and when they are actually working. So, is transportation to and from certain locations, are they traveling to client offices? Are those considered work hours? Are they tracking those hours? So those are just some of the more nuanced areas around work hours that we want to consider. And then overtime. If employees are working overtime, which is working anytime more than 40 hours in any given work week, then they must be paid overtime rates if they're non-exempt. Overtime, now you can, what I typically would recommend, and what I almost always will draft into an employee handbook, is that employees must get approval in order to work overtime. Now, if an employee does work overtime and you have required approval, you do still have to pay them for the overtime that they worked. You can discipline them for violating the policy, and you can even terminate them if it happens, if it's a habit that they've gotten into and aren't able to follow the policies as they've been communicated to them. So that's another piece of that puzzle. Workspace and dependent care. So this is an interesting piece, and I think a big challenge that a lot of us are facing right now is, we weren't planning to necessarily be working from home. So I'm going to speak to this under, what does it look like in normal circumstances? So in normal circumstances, employers are going to be responsible still under OSHA for maintaining a safe and healthy work environment for their employees. And can also, if an employee is injured in the workplace, could be a workers' comp claim. So we want to make sure that we know what our employees' workspaces look like, and that we have some level of control over those workspaces. So under normal circumstances, if you do have a number of employees who are working from home or working remotely on a regular basis, then I would recommend having approval rights over that workspace and actually performing a check of the workspace, taking photos, looking out for any hazards. So if they have sort of exposed extension cords that they could trip over, or a large heavy bookcase that's not anchored into the wall, those types of things would be hazards that we would want to take care of, and that we would want to make note of all of those actions prior to approving an employee working from that space. So this workspace also, you should be a dedicated workspace. Ideally, an employee would have a home office or some other type of dedicated workspace that is considered the workspace when they are performing work for their employer. You might also want to do regular checks. So again, if an employee is working remotely over a long period of time, then you might want to come in perhaps on an annual basis and just make sure that the workspace is still meeting all OSHA requirements and is still, a distraction-free, hazard-free work environment. So dependent care, now this is again a struggle at the moment, but under normal circumstances, you might have dependent care requirements. You might even require that employees have dependent care and are not attempting to care for children while they're working. If you've got employees who are making sales calls 8 hours a day, then it may not be appropriate or possible for them to really be caring for children or any dependents during the workday. So you might have some dependent care requirements there. And then insurance coverage. So I'd always recommend that you require your employees to have homeowners insurance that would cover the workspace were anything to happen to the workspace that caused damage. Again, so I just want to touch here on the circumstances that we're living in today, which is COVID-19 reality, that many workspaces are just not going to be the ideal situations that we would want them to be. And so we may not have the ability or the capacity or even really want to go through the process of approving a workspace. We also will recognize that our workspaces are largely not distraction-free and may not even be hazard-free. So I think that we're all kind of living in our shared universal humanity, that there are pets and children and spouses on the, in our homes and in our workspaces. And so those are, those are just realities that we're dealing with. So we may need to have a little bit more understanding and have a little bit more flexibility, just given the circumstances that we're currently living in. Operational expectations, and this really gets to, the management piece of having employees who are working remotely, is setting what expectations that we have for engaging in our employees in the day-to-day work together. So first, we want to make sure that our employees are really aware of what our expectations are as far as communication and collaboration, working with the team, responding and being available during core work hours, or during any particular hours, and then any reporting requirements. So are they expected to report their activities daily, those sorts of things. Making sure that we have, for any employees where it's appropriate, they might have key performance indicators. So maybe they're supposed to be making a certain number of phone calls a day. Maybe maybe it doesn't matter, what really to you, how many hours that they're working, as long as they are making a certain level of sales. So those sorts of things, what does success look like for that employee, and how are we measuring that success? So setting those expectations as far as, what do we need to be doing on a day-to-day basis. For our firm particularly, we have a morning huddle that we get on at 9:20 every morning. So are they expected to attend regular meetings or regular video conferences? I've even seen managers requiring that employees do have their videos turned on for morning meetings, especially when we're working remotely for such a long period of time. And it's really, the whole team is working remotely. We want to make sure that we're connecting. So what does that look like? And that we're making any appropriate adjustments along the way. So especially here, when we're working for long periods of time, we might have had some time period where we're building trust and building accountability, and that there may be some adjustments that are appropriate there, either to sort of bring folks into line, making sure that that our communication is really that we're staying on top of our communication, that our teamwork is really successful. Technology. So this is, again, a blessing and a curse. When we're looking at technology, we really are going to be looking at what types of information are you sharing. So are you handling sensitive information? Do you have any tools that you require your employees to be using? And are those tools available to them in their remote workspace? What obligations do you have with respect to that information? So if you are handling sensitive information, let's say you are a recruiting company and you're handling employee details, you're handling, the protected PII. So do you have obligations with respect to that information? It's likely that you actually do have contractual obligations. You may even have privacy obligations if, for instance, you're doing business in California. And we've got the CCPA now in effect in California. I will note that in Washington, we have tried and failed 2 years in a row now to pass a privacy law here in the state of Washington. So we'll keep you guys updated on how that develops. What security protocols do you need to have in place? So do you have a VPN, for instance, that your employees are required to log into, or specific systems that they have to use in order to handle specific information? Are they allowed to bring their own BYOD, bring your own device? And do they have to have any kind of security tools for using their own device, for instance, having their email available on their cell phones? And are there any gaps that you need to close there now that you do have employees remotely working and you don't have folks sort of sitting in the office on a regular basis? Now, if there is technology needs, so for instance, your setup, you might need to have folks purchasing keyboards and mice and those sorts of things. Will you cover the costs of all of those tools and equipment, or is the employee going to be required to cover any particular tools? Now, again, if an employee is working from home on a regular basis, are you going to cover the expenses for their internet? Are you going to cover their phone bills? Are you providing an employer covered cell phone? So those sorts of things, what are you covering and what is the employee expected to cover? And then what training do you need to provide? So if you are providing new tools, if you're implementing new tools across your team, you may need to provide some training so that folks are aware of not only how to use a tool generally, but also any specific methods that you use as far as documenting information, or if it's a time tracking tool, do you have specific requirements around how they're tracking their time? So all of those things are things to consider, and just being aware of any contractual obligations and any privacy laws that you might be subject to. Ergonomics and accommodations, again, big challenge right now. Under normal circumstances, we are recognizing that that ergonomics are, it's a benefit and also protection for employers to be sure that employees are working in an ergonomic environment. So employees may actually even have disabilities that would require an accommodation. So if you, for instance, had employees who did have an accommodation when they were working in the office, is it appropriate or necessary, or are you even legally obligated to provide that accommodation now that they are working remotely? So be aware of any existing accommodations, and also be aware when an employee makes a request for accommodation, they may not necessarily request it outright, but if you are, as the employer, are on notice that an employee has a disability and has a need for an accommodation, then you do need to start engaging in that interactive process to be sure that that you've provided whatever reasonable accommodation would be appropriate to accommodate that disability. You do have a right, if the disability and the need for accommodation is not obvious, you do have the right to request medical documentation in order to verify that the employee does actually in fact have a disability and what the nature of that disability is, and even get a medical opinion from their physician around what would be an appropriate accommodation. When it comes to technology and equipment, you may have, for instance, you may need e-reading technology or some other kind of technology that would allow an employee to do their work remotely. And then what does that look like as far as expenses? Who's paying for those accommodations? Again, typically the employer would pay for those accommodations, especially if it's a requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then I'll just touch really quickly on insurance, because this is, we're looking at potential liability here. So if you are going to have employees working remotely on a regular basis, you should definitely have them make sure that they are maintaining an appropriate homeowners insurance policy and getting documentation on that policy. Make sure that you've got your workers' compensation up to date. And then if you do have workers, especially a lot of workers who are working remotely, I would highly recommend talking to your insurance broker about any management liability insurance and any other appropriate policies that you might want to have in place. Okay, so that's remote work. If you guys have any questions at all around remote work or any of the other topics that we're going to be covering today, feel free to submit that in the chat. So we're going to, or in the Q&A, I suppose. So we're going to go into the flexible schedules and unlimited PTO now. All right, so flexible scheduling. This might be a benefit that your employees are really asking for, or that you just simply want to offer as a benefit to your employees. So the first question here is, when is flexible schedules appropriate? And it might even be required. So again, we just kind of got off the subject of disabilities and making reasonable accommodations for employees with disabilities. So if an employee does have a disability, you might actually be required to provide some kind of a flexible schedule, whether that's allowing an hour off on a weekly basis for your employees to go to a doctor's appointment. If it's just a benefit that you're offering, then we want to make sure that we're clear around what that flexible schedule benefit looks like. How much flexibility does the employee have with respect to their work hours? Is it simply flex time, where they can be working any 8 hours during the day, and there's no core work hours that they need to be working within? Or is it a compressed work week? Are they allowed to work, for instance, 4 10-hour days and they just need to hit 40 hours, and that's really all you care about? Is it potentially reduced work hours? It's not necessarily a flexible work schedule, but it might be reduced hours. So again, for instance, if an employee has a disability and they need to work fewer hours in a given week, then that might be, they might have some level of reduced work hours. So again, just setting the expectations around how much flexibility do we have there and what does the schedule look like? Wage and hours, so again, we're going to look at the issue of exempt versus non-exempt. In this case, a non-exempt employee would be a little bit easier because non-exempt employees are only paid for the number of hours that they work. So you've got to have them tracking their work hours and you pay them for the hours that they work. Again, kind of keep an eye on overtime there and make sure that you have required approval for any overtime hours worked. Exempt employees are a little bit more challenging. If an employee is exempt and they work any amount of the work week, if they work at all during a given work week, you are required to pay them their full salary unless you have a bona fide sick policy or something like that that they're taking advantage of. So again, make sure we're setting clear expectations around productivity and communication and what they have to be doing as far as collaborating with the team and communicating with the team, attending meetings, and what does a measurement of success look like for their role. And finally, we may need to look at there might be some growing pains when you're transitioning to a flexible work schedule, as far as, making sure that everyone's got the appropriate accountability, or there may, especially if you're just kind of trying out the flexible schedule thing, it may be a big challenge to transition away from flexible scheduling. So if an employee is used to being able to work whenever they would like, it might be difficult to bring them back to working just core work hours. So keeping those in mind if we're going to try out or test out flexible scheduling. Unlimited PTO. This is a benefit that a lot of employees, I think, maybe used to ask for, but not so much anymore. I haven't seen a ton of unlimited PTO policies of late, but I'll just kind of go over what do the options look like for providing paid time off to your employees. So generally speaking, we're going to have two buckets that paid time off sort of lumps into, and that's going to be having a separate sick and vacation buckets versus having a PTO where all of the time off is lumped together in one bucket. So when you're working within those buckets, I really think that, here in Washington, we've got sick and safe requirements in the state of Washington that you have to be providing for most employers, 1 hour of accrued sick and safe leave for every 40 hours worked. If you're a large employer over a certain number of employee threshold, then you may even be subject to 1 hour for every 30 hours worked, so a little bit more as far as providing sick time available to your employees. So when we have those requirements, then we have this level of minimum protected time that you have to offer to your employees. And when we lump that protected time in with unprotected time in one bulk PTO bucket, it can be a challenge and it can get a little bit cumbersome in the policies to try and set restrictions around that time when a portion of that time is protected. So we can't, sort of set restrictions around when an employee can use sick and safe leave so much as we can if they're just going on vacation. So if we are going to offer unlimited PTO, we want to be aware of the minimum requirements that we have to meet as employers as far as allowing our employees to take sick and safe time and any restrictions that we place on that. For instance, we can't require employees to give 30 days notice to take sick leave. So if an employee is taking leave for a protected purpose, then we need to be complying with any restrictions, any laws that do sort of limit what we can require there. We want to be sure that we are clear about any restrictions or requirements or procedures for taking PTO. So again, if it's just a vacation, you're welcome to require 30 days notice or an approval process. I have actually even worked for a company where there was a specific period of the year that was sort of the peak time, and so really PTO or vacations during that time, were frowned upon and not typically allowed, except under unique circumstances, and did require approval. So I already said protected time here must stay protected. We do want to address the possibility of abuse. I think generally speaking, I've seen two different two different sort of studies online, one being that employees tend to take a little bit less time off actually under an unlimited PTO, and then some that say that employees actually take about the same amount of time. So if you typically offer 15 days, that maybe the employees are taking around 13 to 15 days of PTO even under an unlimited PTO policy. However, we do need to consider the possibility of abuse. So if an employee wants to take, 6 months of PTO, that might not be a possibility. So we do want to be clear about any employees that are abusing the unlimited PTO policy and what that can have, the effect that can have on the morale of the team and just, the general team dynamics. And transitioning from accrued time off, now this can be actually a bit of a minefield. If you have historically offered accrued time off where you've had those 6 vacation buckets or a limited PTO bucket, then you want to take a look at your policies and any requirements for that state around whether you have to pay out that time that they have accrued before transitioning to an unlimited PTO policy. Now, in this sense, actually a vacation, a set amount of vacation can actually be more beneficial to the employees because they could get paid out that vacation were they to leave the company. But with an unlimited PTO policy, since they're not accruing time, then they're not going to get paid out on termination. So in this sense, a set amount of a finite amount of time that they are accruing might actually be preferable. So just keeping those things in mind when we're looking at adopting an unlimited PTO policy. Okay, we're going to shift gears now. We're going to talk about alcohol in the workplace, and this actually surprises a lot of folks when I tell them this. Did you know that employers in Washington are actually prohibited from allowing alcohol in the workplace entirely? L&I has been very clear on this point that as an employer, you must prohibit alcohol from the workplace, alcohol and narcotic drugs. Unless you're in an industry where you're producing. So if you, for instance, are running a winery, obviously alcohol is not going to be prohibited there, but employees can't be drinking while they're on the job. So businesses can actually be cited for violating this rule. And there was some interesting news coverage on this back in 2012 because some workers on the 520 bridge, including one of them was a senior VP, were caught on camera drinking on the work site. And so L&I was very clear that drinking in the workplace is actually prohibited. So you can be cited here. Now, obviously, I've even been in interviews where I've been told that one of the benefits is having beer on tap. They might not have known their audience there, but so how is that allowed? And really, it's not allowed. And the reality is that L&I is not going to go around doing fridge raids, but if they do have a reason, if they're given a reason to come in and take a look, then you can be cited for that. Now, alcohol is permitted at social events when the employee is not acting in the course of their employment. So you can have alcohol at the company holiday party or at a summer picnic. Now, it should be made clear, however, that because the employee is not working in the scope of their job, that attendance is voluntary and any time that they spend there is unpaid. So I do want to address where we're at right now with COVID-19 is, we've seen a lot of folks as far as, trying to maintain the team connection by doing virtual happy hours. And so reality here is, what is the workplace? If the employee is on the clock and if they are, especially in their home office while they're being paid and they're doing a virtual happy hour, technically that would be a violation of this law. Now, is L&I going to come knocking on your door? Most likely not. But technically, employees are not supposed to be drinking while on the clock, and technically, right now, for all of us, our home is our workplace. So that's just something to keep in mind, which generally speaking, there are going to be some best practices as far as staying out of trouble. So one is going to be to set clear expectations with employees and management. And while you may feel that some of these things go without saying, be clear with your employees about what the expectations are around behavior and professionalism. Be sure to discourage overconsumption. If you, so for instance, and train your management on what that looks like. So some of the issues that you start to see are managers or people who are, higher ups in the company making employees feel uncomfortable or like they have to drink or like they have to participate in those activities in order to keep their jobs or in order to advance their careers, and that's where you start to see real problems. Specifically for company events where there is going to be alcohol present, don't require attendance and certainly don't require that the employee consume alcohol. Make sure that it's clear that employees can have their beverage of choice, whether that be water or something else. Take steps to discourage overconsumption. So this is specifically if you're having an event, like a company picnic or a company holiday party. You might want to implement or might think about implementing drink tickets or some other mechanism of discouraging employees from over-consuming. So you might, for instance, limit hard alcohol or not have any hard alcohol available. You might have a cash bar. So those are all sort of some ideas there. And just again, make sure that your management is not pressuring any employees into drinking or making them feel like there's going to be some adverse impact to their career for not participating. Ensure employees have safe transportation. Now, when we're all working from home, maybe we're not transporting, maybe we're not traveling from one place to another after having, for instance, our virtual happy hours. But if you are having employees who are potentially going to be traveling for, after a company holiday party, making sure that they have safe transportation, that might mean providing vouchers to, Uber or Lyft or one of those other rideshare companies, or having cabs available for them to take home should they need it. And then, of course, if you are hosting a company sponsored event, make sure that if the space that you're having it in doesn't already have one, that you have obtained a banquet permit, because that would be a requirement in order to have alcohol available. And then finally, pet-friendly offices. So this is just kind of a bit of a fun one. We actually, in our business complex, we have a pet-related company. So we do see some pets around our complex from time to time. And now pet-friendly offices can be a really fun perk, and it can be a morale boost to employees. But again, it needs to be done the right way in order to avoid liability as well as any issues with employees who don't feel comfortable. So the first step to adopting a pet-friendly office is going to be to check your lease. Your lease may not allow pets, so you might actually need to get express permission there from your landlord, and I would highly recommend just being sure that your landlord is aware that you're going to have pets in the office, and there might be restrictions there. So I worked for a company previously that did have a pet-friendly policy, but we were only allowed one dog every Friday, and everyone who had a dog and wanted to bring their dog in had to get approval and was on a rotation list. So that was the rules of the lease. And so that's what we had to do. Check your insurance. So you will probably need to get you just make sure that your insurance policies would cover any issues that might arise from having pets in the office, especially, considering things like dog bites or, physical damage to property, those sorts of things that might happen if you have pets in the workplace. Check with your employees. Now, of course, you might have employees who have allergies or have a fear of animals. So we want to make sure that our employees are feeling comfortable. And just depending on what your office layout is, there may be certain areas where you can, keep a pet contained to one location. And that way, employees who are not comfortable being around pets or not able to be around pets for health reasons, for instance, then they can kind of be separated from the animals who are in the office. And make sure that we're really clear about any rules and restrictions around having pets in the workplace. So again, a dog who's completely untrained, maybe not potty trained, maybe not good around other pets or around people, dogs who have behavioral problems, who are, generally unsafe if there's a bite, maybe those animals aren't allowed anymore or at all. So making sure that we're communicating those rules. Are there certain areas where pets can't go into? For instance, I wouldn't recommend having dogs in the server room. So things like that. And then making sure that the office is safe for pets. So we certainly don't want to have any injuries or have to have any trips to the vet. So we don't want to have any exposed cords that a dog could chew on, things like that. And then this is actually a tip from Rover that I saw as I was preparing for this presentation. They've got a ruffery team. So that's just sort of a fun fun way to say have sort of a team of people or identified employees who are responsible for making sure that we're addressing any issues that might come up, and also just managing having pet-friendly offices and everything that that would entail. Technology and social media. So this is our last subject that we're going to cover today. Technology and social media, again, big blessing, but can also be a challenge. Many employee handbooks do have technology and social media policies, and I would recommend having one just to address a number of things. And were you to craft one of these technology and social media policies, generally, here are some things that you might want to consider when doing so. So first, you'll want to notify your employees that, generally speaking, they don't have any expectation of privacy when they're using technology or work-provided devices. So when they're at work, they shouldn't have any expectation that their employer can't, for instance, view their internet history on their work computer. That's totally permitted. So we just want to make sure that employees are aware of that. So they shouldn't be going, to any inappropriate websites. And generally speaking, these policies will provide that work devices should only be used for work purposes, and not for personal purposes. We, of course, want to prohibit any harassing or discriminatory or threatening language or posts really on any platform whatsoever, if it is in any way work related. So making sure that we're aware, whether it's a company internal communication platform or a general social media platform, that any harassing or discriminatory language or threatening language that is in any way work related, so about fellow employees, about a coworker, about their manager, that those will not be tolerated. We want to absolutely be clear that confidential and proprietary information and customer information is confidential and is the property of the company and cannot be disclosed outside of the company, and has to be within the policies here. And you can discipline your employees for disclosing confidential information. There's just that's a protection that you have as an employer. Employees might claim that they have free speech, but generally speaking, there are things that they cannot say and things that they cannot disclose when they're working for a company. And we want to make sure that it's clear that employers not be speaking on behalf of the company or be representing the company or in any way imply that they're representing the company. That if an employee, is, for instance, just complaining about work online, which might be fine, might be allowed, and you might not be able to prohibit all speech, that they're not speaking on behalf of the company. Now, to kind of jump off that point, there is protected speech. So there are certain things that we as employers cannot prohibit our employees from doing. So for instance, the National Labor Relations Act and the NLRB guarantee the employees the right to unionize or to engage in concerted activities for the purpose of collecting bargaining or to improve their pay or benefits or working conditions. So employees do have the right to use social media and to share information about their pay and about their benefits and working conditions with coworkers, but individually complaining without some level of group action is not going to be protected. So we just want to be really careful that if an employee does, for instance, complain about their employer or their manager online, that it could be a violation of the National Labor Relations Act to take any adverse action against that employee for making those statements. It's also in Washington, it's illegal to take any adverse action against an employee for disclosing an instance of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct at work. So we want to, again, be careful there. And it's actually illegal to even sign an NDA or require an employee to sign an NDA that prohibits them from disclosing sexual harassment in the workplace. I do want to note that social media posts about an employer are not protected when they are offensive or knowingly false or publicly degrading the products or services and unrelated to any labor controversy. So for instance, there was one case where an employee said something to the effect of, I would have hurt him, I would have, done X, Y, Z if, speaking about their manager, if I wasn't at work. Now that is not protected. So anything that would be, harassing or offensive or threatening, those would not be protected speech. Discrimination in the hiring process. So a lot of folks, a lot of employers will look at employee social media platforms, their Facebook pages, their Instagram pages, in advance of hiring them. And so, while certain things can be taken into account, we want to make sure that we're not taking into account factors that would be considered discrimination. So for instance, anybody who's a member of a protected class, like, just based on their ethnic origin or their gender or their age, that when we are viewing employee social media in advance of hiring, that we're not making decisions based on that membership in a protected class. Again, bring your own device. So I did mention that if you do have employees who are able to access work information from their cell phones, like having email on their cell phones, or they're using their personal laptops to access company information or to perform work for the company, that we are aware of any security requirements and very clear about any security requirements that in order to bring your own device and use your own device for work purposes. And login information to company accounts. So, we've had questions on this from time to time, and I've actually dealt with this, just personally in volunteering for a nonprofit board. It can just be an annoying hassle and annoying challenge to, for instance, start a LinkedIn account for the company and then not have access to it because it was tied to a specific employee's account. You do have a right. Those are the company's accounts, and so those are owned by the company, and so you do have a right to have the login information to those accounts. So I would, generally speaking, require that the employee provide that login information, or better yet, just make it tied to a general account that everybody that the company would have access to, were that employee to no longer be with the company. Okay, and then finally, I've kind of addressed a number of different topics here. We do write on some of these topics from time to time. So here are just a few helpful posts if you'd like to read a little bit more about any of these issues. So one would be our drafting an effective remote work policy. This is a fairly recent post, so you'll be able to see that just, should be in the first page when you're looking through our blogs. And then 3 steps to address data privacy as a business problem. I didn't touch too heavily or get too in depth around data privacy, but did touch on it in a number of the subjects here. So this is really what it looks like to audit your data privacy program and really start to build a data privacy program if you are handling sensitive information. We do also have a post on company holiday parties that speaks specifically to alcohol in the workplace. So check out our blog if you're interested in getting more information about any of those. And of course, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions there. Thank you so much, and I will take some questions now. So if you guys do have any questions, feel free to send them to the chat or through the Q&A. I'll give you guys a few minutes to type if you do have questions. Okay, so I am not seeing any questions come through, so maybe that means I've answered all the possible questions out there, although that may not be the case. But of course, feel free to reach out to us. There's my email address there on the screen, and so you can reach out to me at ashley@equinoxbusinesslaw.com, or just generally reach out to us anytime at contact@equinoxbusinesslaw.com, and feel free to send any questions our way, whether they be COVID-19 related or otherwise. And we look forward to seeing you guys at our next focus event. We are going to have a few events, so keep an eye coming up, I believe, next week. So keep an eye out on our events page for that information as we kind of get all those things sorted. We have a few events that are going to be, particularly timely and helpful. So we're trying to get those put together for you as quickly as we can. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful morning.